The sound of the fall was dry, like the snap of an old branch breaking under the weight of time. When Patrick Grantham collapsed in front of the cameras, no one thought he was at death's door. But behind the suits, the dollar signs, and the headlines, there was a fragile body and a failing heart. Hours later, in a public hospital across town, a young woman walked down a hallway clutching a form stained with urgency. Elise Harper didn't know the patient's name or where the blood would go. She simply extended her arm and gave a piece of her time for someone she would never meet, never imagining she was saving the man who would change her life. 2 days later, they crossed paths in silence at a modest event for the Grantham Foundation. She was among boxes and clipboards, he surrounded by flashbulbs and hollow promises. Neither recognized the other because, at that moment, fate still preferred anonymity. At 54, Patrick Grantham was the kind of man who turned silence into leverage. CEO of a tech and consulting empire, he knew how to manipulate data, speeches, and even disasters. To him, humanity was an abstraction, useful only when it helped sell. He lived in a glass-covered penthouse in Seattle, where the sky always seemed to be under judgment. He was surrounded by an efficient team, but lived essentially alone. His most frequent meetings were with spreadsheets and tax alerts. He was methodical, impenetrable, efficient, like the quarterly reports he demanded down to the last cent. The Grantham Foundation, established 5 years prior, was his public trophy, a non-profit project that, in practice, saved him millions in taxes and earned ethical awards he never bothered to collect. Most of the community centers existed only on paper, enough for photos and deductions. Meanwhile, Elise Harper woke up every morning at 5 to work at Whitmore Hospital. She was 27, caring for her sick grandmother, and had never known what paid time off meant. Her daily life was a never-ending finish line, where everything was urgent but nothing could stop. She never knew her father, and her mother, they said, died shortly after childbirth. She grew up with aunts and in temporary homes, learning early not to expect anything. No gifts, no promises. Her hands were small, but she did the work of 3 people without complaint. That morning, Patrick suddenly collapsed during a live-streamed conference. The collapse was quick, like a circuit breaker shut off in the dark. Paramedics rushed him to the nearest hospital, the same one where Elise was finishing an extra shift in the donation unit. She heard the commotion down the hall and, not knowing who the patient was, volunteered to donate blood. She didn't ask names, didn't wait for thanks. She simply did what she always did. She helped and slipped out the back before anyone could say a word. Patrick's recovery was swift but shrouded in secrecy. The press called it exhaustion, a brief episode. Internally, however, he launched a PR campaign. He unveiled an initiative called Anonymous Gratitude, encouraging stories of kindness in public hospitals. It was an attempt to turn fragility into a corporate narrative. No names were mentioned, least of all the donor who had saved his life. Meanwhile, Elise remained silent. She never told anyone about the donation. She kept cleaning hallways, caring for her grandmother, and trying to ignore the buzz of news from a world that felt like a distant planet. By chance, she heard about a social project in need of volunteers, a new community center in her neighborhood. It was run by the Grantham Foundation. She signed up without hesitation. The building was still under construction, but activity had already begun with young people and coordinators. Elise helped with reading workshops and activities for at-risk teens. She felt useful, part of something she couldn't yet name. During one school supply delivery, Patrick showed up for a quick photo op. He wore a dark suit, a rehearsed smile, and walked with urgency. He passed by Elise without seeing her. She recognized him instantly, not from headlines or interviews, but from a strange feeling in her stomach, as if her body remembered what her mind preferred to forget. She stayed silent, as if guarding a secret the world wouldn't understand. Days later, whispers began circulating among foundation staff. Leaks, ceiling stains, and vibrations that felt like the building breathing too hard. Engineers had sent internal warnings, but Patrick's timeline allowed no delays. The center had to open before the fiscal quarter closed. Elise filed a simple report, handed informally to a coordinator. No one responded. no one wanted to see. That Friday, heavy rain fell over the city from early afternoon. The sky seemed tilted, threatening to collapse on every rooftop. But the opening event at the Harper Center went ahead. Elise arrived early, as usual. She carried a box of donated books and some blocks for a youth activity. It was just another volunteer shift. By late afternoon, she was alone, organizing the main room. There was no rush. She liked the silence that came after the noise. Outside, thunder marked an irregular beat. High above, a beam, already compromised by water damage, began to give way. No one saw, no one heard. When the roof collapsed, Elise was right beneath it. Death was instantaneous. Firefighters arrived half an hour later, called by neighbors who heard the crash. They found only rubble, leaks, and a child's scarf among torn books, as if time had stopped there with her. Patrick was informed by phone during a meeting with investors. He reacted with cold detachment, like it was just another logistical hiccup. He asked his crisis team to handle the fallout. Among emergency reports and documents, one medical file stood out. Elise's name was listed as the victim, but there was also a note about an unusual genetic match with Patrick. Intrigued, he requested a cross-check with hospital records. The answer came within hours: 99.98% genetic compatibility. The tests confirmed Elise was Patrick's biological daughter. Everything he never knew or chose to forget returned with brutal clarity. A name from the past, a brief relationship, a pregnancy never mentioned. She was the thread fate had tried to place before him, and he always walked past. Sitting in his glass office, Patrick looked at his reflection and didn't recognize himself. The woman who had saved him with her blood had been destroyed by his haste, his greed, his negligence, and now it was too late. The media framed it as an operational tragedy. Headlines with technical terms, charts of structural failures, speculations about permits and deadlines. None of them mentioned Elise as a person, only as the victim of a compromised structure. Patrick didn't speak to the media. He made no statements. He signed papers, liquidated assets, and closed contracts while the days blurred into a series of meetings he barely registered. He dissolved the foundation, and before legal actions escalated, he transferred most of his fortune to independent charities in the names of victims and families. He said he preferred to settle things before someone turned it into a campaign. Gradually, his partners abandoned him. The invitations stopped. His name vanished from plaques, websites, and corporate luncheons. It was as if he'd been erased from his own biography. Months later, an aide found him sitting on the floor of his old office, barefoot, staring at a fixed point on the wall. He had slept there. He couldn't remember his own address. The doctor called it adaptive collapse, but anyone who saw him knew he was just a man trying to forget what he had become. He was quietly admitted to a psychiatric clinic in the state's rural interior, a place with no logo, no decorated lobby, no promises. There, Patrick spent most of his days sitting in a gravel courtyard where nothing grew. He said little. Sometimes he asked the time. Other times, he just stared at the nurse's shoes. He never mentioned Elise. But every time someone said the word structure, he lowered his eyes and clenched his hands, as if holding back a new collapse repeating inside him. Some guilt has no voice, only weight. And sometimes silence is the only sentence still standing when everything else has already fallen. Patrick never knew she was his daughter, and when he did, it was already too late. What remained wasn't longing or performative remorse, only absence multiplied by what could have been and never will be. If this story left something suspended inside you, stay with us. The next one also speaks of paths crossed too late, and perhaps a fate that can still be altered.